My name is Stephen Dow. I'm your host for this quarter. And I know many of you are taking this for credit. I've sent emails about this, but just to reiterate, if you're taking it for credit, there's a sign-up sheet that's going around that you'll see circulating around like 15 minutes into the talk that you're supposed to sign to check in. You're supposed to stay and enjoy the rest of the talk as well. If you have to miss a session this quarter, we have a form you can fill out and kind of go back and watch the talks on video and reflect on the talk afterwards. Any questions about the logistics? Great. Okay, so today I would like to introduce Lilly Irani, who is one of ours in the design lab. She's an associate professor in communication and social studies. She's also a member of the design lab, part of the Institute for Practical Ethics, a program lead in the Critical Gender Studies program, sits on the board, the Academic Advisory Board for AI Now, NYU, and she's going to be talking about her new book, Chasing Innovation. How many of you guys have participated in hackathons? So what this talk is going to do is really challenge how you think about hackathons. And I think Lily's work in particular really challenges how I think about my own research. And I hope that she has that similar effect on you. So with that, Lilly.
Okay. Hi, everybody. Can folks hear me in the back okay? It's okay. Okay. I'm hearing. Raise your hand if you're having a little bit of trouble hearing me. Okay. Maybe turn it up just a touch. I can also talk louder, but I thought it would be nice to not, if the amplification was right. So yeah, it's really nice to be here speaking at Design at Large. I was in Stephen's place curating Design at Large last year for one quarter, and this is a place where we get to think about how to, think about bringing people in who can challenge us to imagine how we build and design in ways that kind of hold us accountable to the kind of challenges that the world throws at us, including cultural challenges and political challenges. So this talk is an anthropological talk. So it's going to be a little bit different than the talks that you often get in Design at Large. So I wanted to kind of give some introductory notes. So the talk's going to take the form of an argument, and the argument is kind of made in the form of stories. And the stories that I tell, I'll explain what the significance of those stories is and what I think it has to teach us about design, innovation, and entrepreneurship. But one thing I wanted to say as context is I started this project that is, that culminated in this book when I was actually transitioning from working as a UX designer at Google to being a graduate student in informatics at UC Irvine. So I started this project because I believed in design, and I wanted design to be something that accounted for the different ways that power operates in the world. So as you're listening to it, I have a lot of places where I kind of trouble the ways that we are taught to think about design and innovation, but take this in the spirit of, I was like sitting in your place basically for many of you 10, 15 years ago. And this, this is where I got to by studying how people were actually practicing design in the world. So I'm also going to try an experiment. So for those of you who are from communication or science studies or anthropology, you're going to be very used to the kind of talk that I'm going to give, but I'm also going to do something new with y'all. So at different points during the talk, I'll be sharing stories with you that helped me figure something out that was important to me about design. And so I'm going to ask for a show of hands at certain points about who's resonating with this story, who's experienced something that seems similar to this. And I'm just curious what will happen if we sort of recognize that the things that happen in one place are also things that happen to a lot of us, and how does that help us find people that we want to get together with to try to find better ways to do design and support kind of democratic processes. So, okay, with that, I'm going to start with my first question. How many of us have heard the message that entrepreneurship is how we're supposed to make the world a better place? Raise your hand. Okay, raise them high. All right, own it. All right, well, the center of my talk today is the figure and the ethos of the entrepreneur, or what I'll loosely refer to as entrepreneurialism, as well as the political work it does on the ground in post-liberalization Delhi. If you don't know what liberalization is, don't worry, I will explain in a little bit. This is drawn from my larger book, Chasing Innovation. In this talk, I'm going to explain why innovation, with entrepreneurship as its putative engine, has become so central to Indian imaginaries of development. Entrepreneurial citizenship promises that citizens can construct markets, produce value, and do nation building all at the same time. In this talk, I'm going to show the practices by which people adopt and champion this entrepreneurial ethos in Delhi, articulating entrepreneurship, a new set of practices are being told to adopt, with long-standing hierarchies and systems of meaning that are part of Indian society. So I'm going to argue, and this is a little heavy, I'm going to argue that entrepreneurial citizenship colonizes social life, as it asks the people who answer the call to entrepreneurialism to scratch together any resources they have, whether it's their family ties and kinship, the finance that they can access through those ties or through their environment, raw material or other people's labor, to create investable opportunities that promise value for investors. All this is done in the name of development for quote unquote real India, the India that is posed as needing the kind of improvement that entrepreneurs are said to be able to offer. This real India consists not of entrepreneurs, but as customers, as workers in these entrepreneurial enterprises, or as targets of uplift and development projects. And this regime that I'm calling entrepreneurial citizenship as a way to kind of help us see it working in the world, it turns citizens towards nation building, but nation building as the exploration of potential value, financial value, and the thickening of capitalism's infrastructures. So that's the argument I'm making. It'll be clear what I mean by that when I actually show you the stories of what happens on the ground. So in this process, one of the things that I want to point out is when we think about entrepreneurial citizens becoming resourceful and trying to bring about development, I'm talking not only about entrepreneurial citizens and what happens to people in India who try to do that work, but I'm also arguing in this talk that entrepreneurial citizenship also posits a relationship between the entrepreneurial citizen and those others who are the ones who they're supposed to employ, the ones that they're supposed to sell to, or the ones they're supposed to serve and govern. So I'm arguing that entrepreneurial citizenship is actually a new way of creating hierarchies among citizens, and is putting private citizens in charge of what the government used to be responsible to do and what the government used to have kind of democratic accountability as it was undertaking it. So to give you an overview of how I'm going to work through this, this talk's going to begin by showing the political and economic transformations that pose development as a problem and entrepreneurship and innovation as a solution to that problem. I'm going to look to policy and law and institutional shifts in India to locate how this shift happens and what are the kind of political causes of this happening. I'm then going to move to ethnographic cases. So I'll introduce the design studio in Delhi as an entrepreneurial collective. I'll then move on to showing how the politics of entrepreneurial innovation are not only about the kind of knowledge that gets to be in the room, but also about how time is organized and how time affects who gets to collaborate and participate in civic innovation. And then I'm going to move to middle-class encounters that I'm going to move to encounters that middle-class Indians who are doing design research have with rural Indians that they're trying to help, to show how people who are working in the design studio interpret the creativity of people who don't have the kind of privilege that they do. In this process, I'm going to argue that when these design practitioners go out in the field, it's in the field that they actually kind of produce the difference between innovators and their others, or they kind of mark out why other people's creativity is not as good for nation building as their own. And I'm going to conclude by arguing for the concept of rendering entrepreneurial as a way of naming how private citizens are being called upon to make markets and to extend capitalist firms' connections as a condition of being a good citizen and belonging to the nation. So the work I'm going to present here is ethnographic and historical. I conducted fieldwork over 14 months, day to day in a design studio. I learned Hindi, and what was spoken in the studio was Hinglish, so a kind of mix of Hindi and English that's really common in urban areas. And so I worked as an observer, but also as a team member over these 14 months. To understand how state priorities and understandings of innovation and entrepreneurship shifted over time, I also read and did text analysis of these 5-year plan documents that the government of India has been producing since independence in 1947. I also looked at other kinds of government and industry association planning documents and reports to see when does entrepreneurship come to be posed as a solution to the problems of how to develop India and develop it well. So now I want to dive into the context of what was going on as I was doing my fieldwork and as the people that I was studying were answering this call to become entrepreneurs. Delhi at the time of my fieldwork seemed a development boomtown. Since before independence, Delhi has been a center of development planning to modernize what Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru had called a needy nation. The central government's pre-liberalization 5-year plans and import controls with ideals of socialism and dealing with kind of power imbalances from wealth inequality, those policies had given way after liberalization to facilitating public-private partnerships where the government said, how much of our work can we outsource to private industry? And also these policies had given way to the government asking, how can we get more capital to be invested in India by private industry and by bankers. And so there's a big shift that happened in India with liberalization where socialist ideals, where the state was responsible for building schools and hospitals and infrastructure and making sure rural people were not treated inequitably, that was kind of considered to be unsustainable, and that there were policy shifts that asked the private sector to become more involved in development. Okay, so I have another question for you. So how many of us, and kind of thinking about ourselves as going into technology or design, have hoped that something like civic innovation or tech for social good can be a more meaningful way to actually have a job that we feel like is ethical? Okay, yeah, that's me. That has been me too. That was me at the age of 24. So in the context of India kind of shifting, the Indian government shifting the burden of development to the private sector and investment banks also got really interested in India as a business opportunity. So it's not just, so this call to do social good came at a specific time when banks like Goldman Sachs were directing global investors to the potential of emerging markets in what was called BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, and China. Michigan Business School professor C.K. Prahalad directed business leaders to seek their fortunes at the, quote, bottom of the pyramid. Oh, I'm sorry, I actually meant to be showing you this slide. So the bottom of the pyramid book, this middle book here, is the idea that companies could make a profit while serving the poor. The poor at this time were framed as both entrepreneurs and potential consumers at a time when kind of American and European consumer markets were flagging, and companies were then looking to BRICS in order to find new markets. Ananya Roy is an urban studies scholar who has called this move poverty capital, when the poor come to be seen as a source of bank interest, as a source of consumer revenue, rather than people who are exploited and need policies to help them get more power in, as workers, say, or as citizens. So to give you a sense of the anxieties for which entrepreneurial citizenship in India was a salve, I'll quote directly from a 2013 Planning Commission report exploring scenarios for India's future. These threatening scenarios were frequently invoked in many of the government and civil society workshops I attended, as well as elite news and publications that were published in English in India. Okay, so I quote, this is from a planning document written by government consultants and planners. So, quote, extremism infects more areas of the country. Governments try to win popularity by increasing handouts. Civil society protest movements take up non-negotiable stances. The political logjam becomes worse. Handouts strain government's finances, investments slacken, employment needs do not grow as rapidly as the workforce, and so India's demographic changes become a ticking time bomb. Handouts do not incentivize innovation and entrepreneurship, but instead create dependency. A cash-strapped government is unable to achieve its goal of poverty alleviation through subsidies. So this is a planner saying, if we don't have policies to encourage innovation, we're going to be stuck with all these political threats and log jams and a dependent population. So this report gives a technocratic view from Delhi. This does not represent how all Indians or even all Delhiites saw the problem of development. But I just want to kind of dwell on what this report is saying. Civil society activists here are not key democratic watchdogs, but instead they're seen as too rigid. India's poor are not dispossessed by development processes, but instead are seen as dependent on handouts. The poor are not vigorously engaged in democratic politics over resources, but they're simply staging popularity contests among politicians. And young people who are frustrated with the growing inequality amidst what's called jobless growth, they're recast as a ticking time bomb that kind of needs to be channeled. So this report argues that innovation and entrepreneurship and the institutions that sustain it are the solutions. How did it become a solution, and who deserves the state's support? I want to approach this question by contrasting 3 different prescriptions for entrepreneurial citizenship from 3 elite policy actors. Their visions are varyingly capitalist, Nehruvian, and Gandhian. Yet they share a belief in entrepreneurial innovators as a vehicle for national growth and distribution. Differences among these policy actors signal varied historical strands of development that still animate Indian politics and are still debated today. So I'm not trying to say everyone agrees on entrepreneurial citizenship in the form it takes, but I am saying that even among those who debate entrepreneurial citizenship, there's things they have in common. Okay, so the first person I want to focus on is Arvind Subramanian. He's a former International Monetary Fund economist, and he served as the chief economic advisor to India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi from 2014 to 2018. Addressing a UPenn India Innovation Conference, Subramanian speculated about India's future, envisioning an India that exported information services like programming and tech support, and trained skilled entrepreneurs and managers. These wealthy people from the kind of highly skilled areas of the Indian economy he imagined them investing their capital not only in India, but also in other countries. For Subramanian, innovation emanated from gleaming office towers filled with highly educated people accumulating profit that could register as economic growth statistics, and job creation, and therefore, the argument went, development. He prescribed policies to empower those elites through easing restrictions on land, labor, and trade, and foreign direct investment, to let people who run firms kind of do what they would like. Pitroda, who's on the right here, is like Subramanian, a non-resident Indian deeply involved in central government policy. He headed the National Knowledge Commission during the more centrist party Congress's rule from 2005 through 2014. And during a televised parliamentary panel for the Indian Institutes of Technology, Pitroda spoke about the poorest Indians at the bottom of the pyramid, not as potential workers for elites producing jobs, but as Indians who live in villages who are in need of technical solutions. The market alone, Pitroda argued, and finance capital, bankers, for example, in particular, Pitroda argued that they simply extract value, in his words, through finding vehicles for investment and then taking interest or taking ownership and selling off companies. By contrast, Pitroda argued that engineers have the capacity to innovate by actually going to people, identifying their problems, and creating value by solving those people's problems. Pitroda himself is an icon of the form. In the 1980s, he had actually led a central government project that brought rural telephone all over India through building custom hardware and figuring out schemes where each village would actually have a telephone box that would be run by independent entrepreneurs. So each village would have like one telephone station instead of every house having a telephone. And that's how a country that was trying to be socialist in its development made do for spreading resources across 1 million people. So Pitroda's vision was not about inventing for export, but rather of dedicating professional Indian inventiveness to domestic consumers and citizens' needs, a vision that included a role for the state and not just private industry. So the third person I want to focus on is Dr. Anil Gupta, who's a professor at the Indian Institute of Management in Ahmedabad. So for those who don't know, this is kind of like the Harvard Business School of India. Actually, it was started in collaboration with Harvard in the 50s. So Anil Gupta, he saw rural India, not engineers, not people in gleaming office towers, rural India as the true hotbed of innovation, as he called it. He evangelized his cause through TED Talks, a trade book called Grassroots Innovation, and even working in the Indian government as head of the National Innovation Foundation. For decades, Anil Gupta led annual yatras, or walking pilgrimages through rural India with groups of students and researchers looking for appropriate technologies, inventions, and inventors that brought traditional knowledge traditional knowledge to bear on people's problems. And his hope was that by doing this yatra and finding these inventors, that he could bring the resources of the government to bring those inventions to scale and to market. These rural innovators, Gupta argued, they made affordable, reparable, and clever technologies driven by their impatience to make life easier. Gupta and his team publicized and scaled up these inventions, even inventing new kinds of patents that respected rural innovators' rights to share with each other for free, while making sure that companies who used the innovation would pay royalties to the rural innovators. He'd also run a newsletter for decades, kind of educating people, kind of spreading knowledge from one part of India about kind of rural innovations to other parts of India and translating it into a bunch of different languages. So he's been walking the walk long before innovation was cool, and trying to make innovation accessible in a way that's pretty rare, I think. So these are three starkly different visions of who is an innovator, what innovation looks like, and by consequence, what policies and practices locate and support these special kind of innovative people. But they agree on a basic vision of the inventions of the few replicated by workers for the benefit of the masses, all while producing what is recognizable as exchange value or profit. Economic growth here is understood as how much kind of profit is generated in the economy. So if innovation was to fuel development, entrepreneurs were those who championed, managed, and drove it. This figure of the entrepreneur was not quite the one who anticipates, economizes, competes, and invests in the self as analyzed by Carla Freeman, Michael Fair, or Wendy Brown. These are social theorists who think about the ways that we're all asked to become entrepreneurs. We're all asked to see how we can kind of make opportunities for ourselves by investing in ourselves and our human capital. That scholarship's really important, but this image of the entrepreneur I'm talking about is different than that. This was the image of the entrepreneur that I'm talking about here is also a manager of others through organization, through know-how, and through resourcefulness. This is the other directed vision of the entrepreneur put forth by economist Joseph Schumpeter in the mid-20th century as a creative agent that generates novel sources of profit within the economy. Who here has heard of Schumpeter? Raise your hand high. Okay. And who's heard of creative destruction as a phrase? Okay, creative destruction comes from this economist, Joseph Schumpeter. Because the entrepreneur for Schumpeter was an agent of innovation who figured out how to make new arrangements of existing resources, relationships, and technical know-how to figure out new ways to make a profit. And so for Schumpeter, the entrepreneur was the way that the economy could keep growing, because the entrepreneur would always figure out new ways to make value in the economy. Interestingly, Karl Marx actually predicted that as companies compete on cost, they'll make less and less profit competing with each other, which means workers will get paid less, which means revolution will happen. So Schumpeter said, no, revolution won't happen because entrepreneurs will keep finding new ways to make value. So this debate's been pretty important to how we think politics is supposed to work. So the entrepreneurial citizen I'm talking about made sense in India by drawing on older hierarchies of citizens in Indian society. So Nehru, India's first prime minister, posited one India that plans, leads, and administers, and a whole other India that had to be developed through education, work, health, and hygiene. People who are too poor to properly know what they needed, too poor to properly participate in a democracy. So Partha Chatterjee calls this political society as compared to civil society. So for Nehru, planners, scientists, and managers, these special educated people, were also meant to be separate from the squabbles of politics and parliament, systematically allocating resources and regulating production to express what's right for a fragmented nation. Nehru backed this belief that you had to have technocrats who could objectively determine what's best for development, who are outside of democratic accountability. He backed this belief by investing in the IITs and the IIMs and the National Institute of Design to produce people who could do these jobs. So Gandhi, who is also a big part of the Indian independence effort, and has anyone here not heard of Gandhi? Yeah, so Gandhi also believed in elite leadership, but he had a different spin on it. So for Gandhi, he articulated what he called the trusteeship system, where the very wealthy would keep their wealth. It wouldn't be taxed away or redistributed, but by keeping their wealth, these trustees were supposed to spend it wisely for the benefit of the wider public, including their own workers. So key to this was that Gandhi actually didn't believe that workers knew the best ways to use resources that they were given to them, and that those who had wealth, the wealth was evidence of their managerial acumen and cleverness. And so that's why he believed in this system where the wealthy should kind of give to those who work for them and live around them, but don't need to be democratically accountable to them. So the entrepreneur that I'm talking about here in India is not just the anticipatory neoliberal subject, but also the manager and governor of their fellow citizens. So concrete shifts in the political economy, kind of in policy, in economic policy, and in political structures, laid the groundwork for entrepreneurs as a solution to the problem of development. The central government turned to the entrepreneur as an agent of development through this process of liberalization that I mentioned before, a process where the state ceded power to industrialists, relaxed labor regulations, and ended many kind of public sector monopolies in things like steel or transportation. With liberalization, the once import-substituting Indian state began to cite private entrepreneurs in the planning documents as those who'd have to carry forward the state's work, building roads, creating hospitals, supplying commodities people needed. India turned from an import-substituting economy into one that had to, as Laura Baer argues, be repackaged for private investment and service the debt interest that they owed to World Bank and IMF. So entrepreneurs were the ones who were supposed to step in as citizens and transform the problems and struggles of everyday life into sites that could generate investment and profit in order to then be taxed by the state and kind of pay interest on these IMF loans. The state, I want to say, like, this project of entrepreneurial citizenship is not just about ideas and practices that the state encourages people to take up. It also ends up in citizenship law. So during this time in the mid-2000s, like leading up to the mid-2000s, the Indian government actually created whole new categories of citizen called person of Indian origin and non-resident Indian as a way of drawing the diaspora, and especially Silicon Valley kind of Indians, back to India as people who could invest money and as people who could kind of bring managerial and technical expertise to India. So you actually have the country like redefining citizenship because they want to get those special people that are recognizable as having kind of innovation expertise. So with this shift to entrepreneurship, innovation came to signify technologically mediated approaches that could be reproduced at large scale. Build something and scale it up, and that's the kind of solution we value. Transformations in intellectual property law were actually central to this shift. So in the 5-year, since the 1970s, India had historically prioritized in its IP law giving wide access to people, giving people wide access to drugs or to technical knowledge. So they had a patent regime where they enforced process patents but not product patents. That means if you invent Prozac in the United States, if someone in India can figure out a different way to manufacture Prozac, that would be fine, and India could produce generics. And this actually made India one of the biggest providers of affordable drugs to many countries that we would call developing. But in the mid-2000s, the United States led TRIPS, the Trade-Related Intellectual Property Agreement, kind of forced India to accept product patents, forbidding the production of goods that had already been invented elsewhere, even if India figured out a different way to make it. And this was a way that the US kind of enforced the interests of the pharmaceutical industry and the software industry in other countries as the internet was making it possible for people to sell and ship software and pharmaceuticals abroad. So part of what I want to argue here is that innovation is not just an idea that got popular because it made sense to people, although it is that. I'm also saying that innovation made sense to the government because the government got really invested in the pharmaceutical and software industries once it was kind of pressured to change its intellectual property laws to be more similar to the US and Europe. So it was in this context that a bank CEO could sit on a panel at Davos where the panel included an Indian minister, it included people from Amnesty International, and they were talking about political unrest in India, the Arab Spring. It was in this context that this bank CEO could say, quote, "In India, it's the entrepreneurial spirit that has contributed a lot to growth. And how can public-private partnership work together in every field? Health, education, expanding the sources of employment." Referring to development, the CEO continued, "It's a responsibility for everyone and an opportunity for everyone." So I've been explaining to you how development came to be seen as an opportunity to make profit. So through myriad practices, conclaves, hackathons, and design research, for example, government, industry organizations, investors, and foundations called on entrepreneurial citizens to reimagine everyday life as a site of this opportunity. I want to examine these practices both as ways of making knowledge and also as ways of organizing work in collaboration and civic activity, meant to translate culture and social relationships and the feelings people have about building up the nation, what we call affect in social theory, translating that into potential financial value. So the first story I'm going to share with you is about a design, entrepreneurship, and cultural festival organized by Dev Design, the studio with whom I did the bulk of my fieldwork. So I'm going to introduce you to Dev Design. This studio numbered between 6 people and 20 people over the 5 years that I followed their work. The founding members were born, raised, and educated in India, and of the founding and early members, many had worked in corporate jobs at banks, at consumer product companies, and in media and big media companies. But they left those big, secure jobs because they wanted to create a studio where they could do work that, in their words, felt more authentic to who they are and offered, again in their words, more creative scope. Though they were also running a business while they were trying to be creative, and so they were always evaluating, okay, how are we adding value? They're always evaluating, are we adding the right kinds of services? What makes us different from other design studios? That's something I talk about in chapter 4 of the book, but I'm not going to dive too deep into that today. Interestingly, only a few of the people who worked at the studio had actually trained as designers. A lot of them had degrees in business or engineering, but they saw design as a way to make more locally relevant products that also gave them room to express what they thought India should be like in the future. So just to give you a sense of the kind of work they did fieldwork for London global health startups, redesigning hand sanitation products. They would get hired to coach Indian college students in design thinking to innovate water distribution. So this is actually not that dissimilar to some of the work that we do in the design lab. And the studio also would refine and retool corporate products, like say databases for a big tech company, to see how you could find corporate social responsibility projects that could be built with that company's products. So important here is the studio is not only practicing design, but they were into it enough that they actually evangelized it. They really saw this as a more promising way to participate as citizens. And they tried to convince other people. So one of the places where they tried to convince other people was a festival, which I'm going to call Open Lab. And that festival was there to stimulate and showcase experiments in design, innovation, expression, and social change over 2 days in Delhi. So the festival is not just about technology. It also included experimental food tastings, like panels about literature in multiple Indian languages, and music events in the evenings to attract and engage people through lots of different ways of sensing and experiencing. The reason I'm talking about this is because the hackathon that I'm going to tell you about was just one of the events at this festival, and one of the things that I think for those of us who follow the kind of tech blowback, as it's called, where we talk about Silicon Valley and focusing on tech solutions, we assume that there's people who are pushing tech all the time, but these were not people who are necessarily only into tech, but they were into innovation-driven social change through tech, music, food, and beyond. So the hackathon that I'm going to tell you about that I participated in was just one example of a multi-day festival workshop that was meant to immerse participants in a kind of transformation of what they called hands-on, hearts-on, and minds-on development activity. Other workshops included designing craft programs for a Gandhian NGO in Ahmedabad and developing solar power in an experimental city called Oroville. So what these workshops had in common is that they brought together people who didn't know each other to spend a few days dreaming of development projects and then making those dreams concrete as demos, plans, or presentations. So these workshops is a place to bring people together, get them to work with people they don't necessarily know or trust, and push them to kind of come up with something in the end. Like, that's going to be really important for what ends up happening in the hackathon teaser. So anyone here not know what a hackathon is? Okay, bless you. Welcome to UCSD. Or I don't know, my tech world. So what a hackathon is kind of like a multi-day software production party. It comes out of open source cultures where open source programmers would get together at conferences to kind of repair software bugs that were too hard to repair when they were all distributed on mailing lists. But they've been taken up by companies like Facebook or foundations like the Gates Foundation as a way of getting people together, providing them with space, takeout dinners, electricity, Wi-Fi, and a roof over their heads, and encouraging designers and engineers to, and sometimes community members to come up with projects that answered an organizer's agenda, whether that was build apps on Facebook's social graph, or in our case it was about building open technology for governance, and it was up to us to figure out in this hackathon in Delhi what we thought that meant. So as we ambled into the studio at 9 a.m. this first morning, the cook at the studio handed us some chai and some breakfast biscuits, and we sat with laptops at a long open table. The convener of the hackathon had us introduce ourselves and our motivations. Many of us spoke of the seduction of tangible action, of making and doing something rather than just complaining about how things were going with politics. One young Bangalore software consultant wanted to quit complaining about governmental inefficiency to see, in his words, if we can really make a difference. An IIT-trained designer said, I want to see if design could actually, quote, save the world instead of just making posters about it. The convener, himself a startup founder who came from a long family of Indian bureaucrats, so bureaucrat in India not being a bad word necessarily, but people who were kind of serving the nation and administering his programs, he saw the hackathon as a kind of continuity of what his family had been doing, but through this private entrepreneurial effort to help citizens like him turn their energy to what he called good governance. So I went to the hackathon not with a critical point of view, not thinking like, oh man, I'm going to find the problems with this. I went to the hackathon after I thought I'd finished my fieldwork, because I thought, okay, what happens if I bring all the stuff that I've read in anthropology and in feminist studies and my coding and design skills to the table, and I try to actually build a technology that I think would kind of go towards a horizon of justice the best way I could. So I came here with a genuine hope and a kind of disposition to start building things and building fast that I got as a computer science undergrad and that I kind of reinforced when I worked in industry before going to grad school. Even anthropologists were kind of intrigued by this hackathon. So Prem, a legal anthropologist, came because, in his words, quote, anthropologists sit and critique things, but they never get around to doing anything. How many in the room have said something like that? Oh, we're just critiquing things, we're not getting around to doing anything. Got one hand in the back. Oh, okay, Steven's kind of like, maybe me too, actually. Yeah. So among us, three of us were consultants who had various code consultancies, design consultancies, and what that meant was a lot of us had the hope that, okay, even if we build something at this hackathon, maybe some of these consultants can go get grants or work for the government, convince the government to take up what we build. So we kind of had this hope that some of the people could carry the project forward. All right, so the reason I'm saying this is because a lot of times when people talk about capitalism, they talk about ideologies where people believe that capitalism or private companies are the only way to make social change. And that wasn't actually exactly what was happening here. This hackathon was an event where it was like, well, maybe it could be a startup, or maybe the government will actually want to maintain it. And we were kind of open to those futures. And that'll become important. I'll explain why that's important later on. So we began by familiarizing ourselves with the domain. The convener, Vipin, recruited a friend from an NGO that works at Parliament. And that NGO director directed us to this process called the Parliamentary Standing Committee as a place where we could help citizens get involved in the legal deliberations happening in that committee. I even actually recruited a planning commission officer I knew to go do field work and get kind of contextual, feedback from people who are working in that context to try to design something better during the time that we had. So, the hackathon brought together not only people doing work, but also the knowledge, the favors, and the kind of relationships that we each had that we were kind of bringing to the table. Remember, entrepreneurialism is about resourcefulness. But these activities were interwoven with expressions of time anxiety. Someone, most often the software engineers, would ask, how long can we talk about the law? Can we, forever as it turns out, could we scope the time of debate to assure ourselves we can get to the demo that we had to show at the actual festival? So we moved Post-it notes around on the board and tried to negotiate milestone deadlines. But the deadlines here were not just a reality check. Like I remember someone telling me, but doesn't everyone have deadlines? But what I'm actually arguing is that the deadlines of the hackathon here, the doing big things in ridiculously short amounts of time, is actually a kind of moral hallmark of people who can put their differences aside, learn to trust people really quickly, and deliver innovations that promise potential value. Even if it means you have to cut short deliberation, ethical debates, bringing in other people into the processes. Fairly quickly, major differences, or what we might call drama, emerged in how Prem and Vipin understood politics to work. So Prem's a legal anthropologist, Vipin was the convener who had the startup. So Vipin expressed kind of technocratic fantasies of a website that would link dispersed Indian experts with state planners and politicians to, in a sense, get these kind of expert citizens to come and debug the law that was being moved through Parliament. Prem, on the other hand, had studied the implementation of the Forest Rights Act, which was meant to give people in Indian forests rights to the land that they lived on. And he knew that even, while it does matter what the law says, that on the ground, police officers or local officials also use the law in power struggles, where often whose interpretation of the law wins out is determined by violence or by local power. So Prem didn't believe that if you just debug the code of the law, you're going to get to more justice. And a lot of us actually at the hackathon shared Prem's kind of belief that we need to account for the ways that you can't have elite experts substitute for supporting the poor in their politics. So these differences generated conflict, and the deadline disciplined us to grasp for threads of agreement. Prem, the anthropologist, found it agonizing. I, as a trained computer scientist and designer, found it exhausting, but also weirdly exhilarating. Like, oh man, I'm gonna find the third way through this. So Prem and Vipin got into a heated debate, and many of us sided with Prem. And working with and through the case studies that Prem had from his own research, the interactions that followed were peppered with, well, what could you do? Or what if we do this? So how many of you have been in these situations where you're trying to save the team from fraying apart by finding the strands of hope of how the project could go well? Raise your hand if you've been there. Hey. So Vipin went away to run some errands, and while he was away, we developed a concept that would allow a concept kind of website that would allow organizers to document face-to-face deliberations of poorer constituencies out in rural India, for example, or in the outskirts of cities, to get them involved with central government issues. And the way we would do it is by not assuming that everyone can use technology, but by working through activist networks. So Krish, one of the programmers who was, believe it or not, really into feminist science studies, he told us tales of how technologically savvy villagers could be as he was biking through Maharashtra. Prem drew on his own fieldwork to show that the people who are trying to fight for their land rights actually are connected to each other and through activists to help us understand how our website could kind of augment their existing ways of organizing and their existing knowledge instead of trying to replace it. So at the time, it seemed like the hackathon could even accommodate a more leftist kind of politics. I'm not saying you should be leftist. I'm just saying that's not a stereotype of how tech culture works. But Prem warned us to do this, it would require what he said was some real footwork to get on the street and work with existing organizations thinking in terms of political participation. But as the sun sank deeper in the sky, we realized we had little time to work with NGO or activist networks. We had little time to understand those networks' information practices or to build trust with them. We couldn't even promise maintaining whatever demo came out of a potential collaboration. So why would they invest their time in us if we couldn't promise that we were going to sustain the thing that they invested in? So how many of you have worked in situations where you felt this kind of pressure, that there's not enough time to do what you feel is right by the communities that are affected by your project? All right, yeah, fair number of hands in the room. So the hackathon, a foreshortened change project, could only draw on the knowledge, desires, and relationships we brought into the room with us. The time, tools, and skills in the room, they were geared towards the work of making prototypes, but not footwork, not trust work. Even the kinds of prototype work we could undertake was limited by the political economies of internet production in a country where only 10% of people at the time had access to the internet. So Krish, the feminist software engineer, explained to us, okay, in the long term, beyond the hackathon, maybe we could build a project that's not just built on WordPress and Drupal and digital infrastructures. Maybe we could actually get into rural areas by using rural kiosks, phone-based systems, or SMS-based systems. He said, quote, "In Andhra, there's that women's radio station. The scope of what we want to envision is that. But what we implement in 5 days is probably a website." This was a 5-day hackathon, by the way. It was very long. The skills in the room were of the web, and web tools were those that were most at hand for urgent hacking. So Krish continued, we're going to have a conversation where we'll chop off everything that we want to do. Cut, 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 cut. But maybe if there's a master document accompanying our chopped up little demo, and he trailed off. So zooming out, the hackathon carried with it hidden pedagogies that I argue are in common with social enterprise and much design practice, at least in the fieldwork that I did. So I'm going to focus on 3 here in brief: a bias to action, the management of the political, and the reliance on others' labor as infrastructure. So first, the hackathon celebrated a bias to action. So when I say bias to action, how many have heard this term bias to action or bias for action? Okay, so the bias to action is something that comes up a lot in kind of business and innovation culture, but it actually comes from these McKinsey consultants who were writing in the mid-'80s, Peters and Waterman. And Peters and Waterman were trying to figure out, how do you manage corporations when rational, predictive, and linear modeling has failed, when deliberation in some sense has failed? The world, they argued, was one of complexity and rapid change, and so they advised managers to quickly research, implement, experiment, and learn rather than run into what they called analysis paralysis. The bias to action actually made it from the design studio in Delhi to job descriptions where I used to work at Google, where Google also wanted people who have a collaborative nature, comfort with ambiguity, and bias to action, the kind of attributes you need to survive a hackathon. So this bias to action in the context of India actually overlaid with this sense of urgency that, okay, we've got this demographic dividend. These young people, if they don't get jobs, are going to become politically unstable. Remember those planning documents, right? So already in India, there was a sense that democracy and deliberation's too slow. And these work practices from tech culture that urge doing things quickly and not deliberating too democratically kind of overlaid with that push to just, act fast and break things, which we can talk about in Q&A. There's a lot of powerful examples of that in the last few years. So to achieve this bias to action, politics and conflict had to be managed to generate creativity without hampering the actual implementation of the creativity. This is the second hidden pedagogy. So conflict was useful on teams because it generated feedback about potential risks for the project or generated inspiration about potential opportunities for the project. Conflict could even generate new ideas. So sociologist David Stark talked about hierarchic flat organizations where you actually do want to bring in different forms of knowledge to have friction with each other because that helps you understand potential lines of value when you're exploring new possibilities. So out of what Stark calls creative friction come new understandings of where the team should go and what it should prioritize. Entrepreneurship channeled this conflict, we have our political conflict between Prem and Vipin, for example, into opportunity rather than collective deliberation or antagonism or organizing a social movement or pressure building. Entrepreneurial conflict could be generative, so you want it on the team, but it shouldn't stop action. The last hidden pedagogy I'll touch on here was so I'll actually say one of the ways this manifested in design processes is you wanted diversity on your teams, but you didn't want the kind of diversity that would stop your project from continuing. So I think it's really interesting the ways that we see diversity being included, but inequality or oppression not actually being addressed in this model of diversity for creative friction's sake. Okay, so the last hidden pedagogy I'll touch on here was one of relying on labor, ready to hand to reproduce the design. The generative potential of the hackathon relied on hidden labor buried in digital infrastructures, ready to hand but maintained out of sight. 24/7 servers, code libraries written and maintained by others, the Foxconn workers that made computers cheap enough that we could all have, a lot of us could have them and participate in these kinds of events, and the metal mining that fuels that. So as participants, we barely questioned how parliamentary bills would be transcribed, cleaned, and formatted for the web. This kind of data labor was freely available both in BPO outsourcing offices and also in microwork systems like Amazon Mechanical Turk. This assumption that there's cheap enough labor to kind of do a bunch of the work that you're going to need to innovate, it wasn't limited to the digital. It also existed for plastics. So designers working in the studio developed product design plans in plastic and metal at a great distance from the kinds of factories that would be needed to make their designs actually accessible to the masses at scale. But they only worried about labor questions when they brought up the product cost or affected manufacturability, or threatened the kind of, or made it impossible to realize the designer vision. So mostly kind of labor was taken for granted as an infrastructure, and that's the product of policies. So the space of creative freedom at the hackathon and at the design studio more broadly required the unfree labors of those who produced and maintained the infrastructures that made this form of production and expression possible. So these pedagogies of entrepreneurial time actually, in the interest of time, I'm gonna skip, yeah, exactly. So I'm gonna just skip the next case study, and I'm gonna go to the conclusion. If you wanna know about rural innovation and how rural innovation compares to the kinds of creativity that was being privileged by both the government and the designers that were in the Delhi worlds that I studied, ask me about it in Q&A, and I'm happy to talk about it. But I want to kind of conclude that by zooming out even further to talk about what I call in the book the subsumption of hope. So I spotted this Rolex ad in The Economist in 2013. It promises that, quote, anyone can change everything. The anyones in this ad are crucially people of color, rather than the white saviors that we've all learned, not to send into the lives of people all over the world. In this vision of the world where you have people of color who are solving problems for both people where they live and then through the network for people all over the world, social enterprise can promise a world without poles, where global South elites can be presented as grassroots South-South achievement. Colonial anthropologists, going back 200 years, they worked for companies or for governments to produce knowledge about people who are different in service of projects of colonialism and also projects of making profit. Knowledge constructing what those other people are like, whether it's tradition, knowledge about castes or tribes, helped render those unknown worlds navigable by patrons like financiers, philanthropies, government agencies, and companies. And so I want to argue that actually entrepreneurs, if we just answer the call as we're called to make the world a better place for Goldman Sachs, we are acting a bit like these colonial officials who are also helping map people's everyday lives for places where we can stick innovations that primarily connect them to companies or even governments that don't necessarily always respond to the political needs that the people have. So we're used to thinking about us going out into the field as a way of bringing knowledge about context and culture to try to do better for people. But in my book, I actually talk about one case where people tell the designers exactly what they need, which is fluoride filters, and the client, the foundations and the NGOs, they want to make bacterial water filters, and that's what they're going to sell. And so that's another example in the book where going out and learning about people's practices is not enough to actually be accountable to them when they ask you for solidarity to actually develop in the ways that they see fit. So change here in this ad is a wide open, vague signifier, like a Nike swoosh. You can kind of project whatever you think your ideal of change is onto this sense of possibility. Civil society and our hopes to make the world a better place, wherever they fall on the political spectrum, whatever dreams that they draw on, they become engines of enterprise. Enterprise kind of organized through hackathons, through design thinking, and through social enterprise pedagogies. The promise of entrepreneurial citizenship, by design, I argue in the book, it bends people away from the slow, threatening work of building broad-based social movements around visions or demands by constraining us to see how we can bring our aspirations and produce something quickly that somebody can kind of then fund or produce as a new kind of business line. So This ad also visualizes a political strategy behind networked entrepreneur-led development meant to transform potential threats into generators of opportunity. So if you don't believe me that entrepreneurial citizenship is meant to get people away from kind of building social movements or kind of threatening power, this is how I'm going to kind of demonstrate the point to you. So in 2009, President Obama announced entrepreneurship promotion programs and competitions as a key diplomacy tool and development strategy in Muslim-majority countries. In 2010, Hillary Clinton, then Secretary of State, posited entrepreneurship as a way of producing what she called a civilian development community abroad, inoculating people around the world against the temptations of terrorism by enlisting them in the promise of entrepreneurial growth. And so that's what you see in the CNN article, Drop Entrepreneurs Not Bombs. That's a story by an entrepreneur from New York who gets sent by the State Department to the Middle East to teach people how to channel their dissatisfaction into kind of entrepreneurial efforts. Anne-Marie Slaughter, a Princeton political science professor and an associate of Clinton's, wrote a book called The Chessboard and the Web that argued that networked media, Twitter, Snapchat, the ways that people kind of share ideas and now we're kind of worried about is causing radicalization. Slaughter argued that this networked media demands a vision of statecraft, not based on nation-to-nation diplomacy, elect your government, you elect yours, and then we'll have them talk, but instead, creating citizens who move around the world as what Slaughter calls manager integrators, the ones who can travel, translate, and stimulate global diplomacy by creating new ventures and creating new civil society organizations. So to wrap up, Returning to the ad and its abstracted networks, this ad talks about agents of change not only in towns, not only in nation states like India, but also around the world. And these networks are vague. Like, these networks can be the connection, these can be IT and media circulation networks that get innovators' visions out into the world making impact. They can be retail distribution chains that designers rely on to get their products to people. They can be self-help groups and community networks, social movement groups that have actually been used by private companies in developing countries to move product in the last 10 years. So this ad makes it possible to imagine being the kind of person who has the entrepreneurial agency to attract, organize, and channel diverse life worlds and social relations into investable opportunities. Scholars of development following Foucault might see this as an example of what's called rendering technical in the literature on development, translating the world into a target of expertise and the interventions that that expertise requires. In other words, rendering technical is a little bit like if you are an expert and you have a hammer, you go around looking for nails because you know how to pound nails in to solve problems. The sites that I study, however, they actually organize work in these hackathons to be participatory, to bring multiple knowledges into the room, into generative friction in the search for value. So in the book, I actually call this rendering entrepreneurial, the making of the world into a place of experiment, where many, many experiments, even ones done with the best of intentions to pursue social good, are kind of constrained such that they don't pose a political threat, but they generate new possibilities for innovation. Venture capitalists and corporations stand ready to harvest the most successful of these experiments. So what I'm asking for in this talk is rather than answering the call to become entrepreneurial when we see change that we want to see around us, let us find ways to work in solidarity with those already dismantling oppression and exploitation in ways that innovation encourages us to ignore, to forget, or to be too time constrained to really kind of engage with and be accountable to. And how do we do that? That's what we have to figure out together. I don't have the answers, so if you're thinking about asking me in Q&A, thank you so much for your attention, and I apologize if the talk was long. Thanks.